I need you to hold a question in your head before we go a single sentence further into this video, because the answer is coming, I promise. And when it arrives, it is going to reframe everything you thought you knew about where Harry actually stands with his own family right now. The question is this: what does it actually take for a son of the King of England to be privately compared to Brooklyn Beckham, of all people? Not by a tabloid columnist looking for a headline, not by a Sussex critic with an axe to grind, but by someone who gets that comparison from people inside the family itself. Not publicly, not in a newspaper column or a TV debate, privately, by people who sit close enough to the throne to know, in conversations that were never meant to reach us, but that have reached us anyway through sources I am going to tell you precisely why I trust. Sit with that question. Let it do its work, because by the time we are done today, I am going to give you the exact moment the comparison was made, who made it, and why it might be the single most devastating thing anyone has said about Prince Harry in years. We are going to cover a lot of ground today, and I want to make you a promise right now. Every question I open, I close. Every thread I pull, I follow all the way to the end. So stay with me, because most of what you have been told about this so-called reconciliation is a beautifully constructed, very expensive lie. And we are going to take it apart piece by piece together. Let me set the scene first, because you need the full context before the analysis lands the way it should. There is a trip, a rumored return. The story being fed to friendly media right now is that the mood between Harry and the palace has somehow miraculously softened.
There's a lot of wariness about this, right? They don't trust them, period. They just don't trust them. I mean, Harry to them is like Brooklyn Beckham is to the Beckhams now.
That the music has changed, as one commentator put it, that a warm and healing family reunion might be not just possible, but actually imminent. You may have seen the coverage. You may have felt the pull of it because it is genuinely well constructed, and it speaks to something most of us want to believe, which is that families can be repaired and that people who love each other find their way back. It is a good story. It is also, in my honest assessment, almost entirely fiction, and I want to show you exactly why, piece by piece. The first thing I need to do is tell you about a source, because sources matter enormously in this world, and the source behind the most important claim today is one I want to explain carefully rather than just assert. I am talking about Piers Morgan, and I know what some of you are thinking. But hold that instinct for a second, because the reason I take this specific information seriously has nothing to do with Morgan as an individual and everything to do with who he actually talks to.
How do you trust this son of yours who every single time you see him in the last few years, everything gets leaked?
Well,
right? And then you add Meghan to the mix, who said she'd never come back to the country, who has spent years trashing our country, who's branded the royals a bunch of callous racists, right? And the pair of them are stuck in. Imagine it's your family.
This man is friends with Queen Camilla. He speaks to Queen Camilla. He is friends with the princesses Beatrice and Eugenie. And just weeks ago, he was photographed at a social event alongside Princess Beatrice and her husband Eduardo. That is a whole other story for a different day. But the point is this: he is not guessing. He is not speculating based on public reporting or palace statements. He has direct, personal, social access to the heart of this family, and what those lines are telling him over and over again, consistently, is that the royal family does not trust Meghan Markle. Not conditionally, not diplomatically, not in the way that leaves a door fractionally open. Full stop, they do not trust her. And Harry, in their private reading of the situation, the private reading that rarely escapes palace walls but has escaped this time, has become to his family what Brooklyn Beckham is to the Beckhams. Let that sit for a second, because we will come back to it, and I want you to understand exactly what it means and exactly why it matters as much as it does. First, though, I want to show you the other side of this, the Sussex side, because you cannot understand the lie without meeting the person currently telling it. Like the best channels doing this properly, the like button on this video helps enormously and costs you nothing, so hit it now and come back because this is going to get a lot more interesting. The Sussexes, in my reading of how this whole machine operates, have spent years cycling through media advocates. People they send out to make their case in the press, to frame the narrative, to keep the story sympathetic. They had one for a long time, a man whose voice became so reliably useful to them that when he spoke, You knew exactly which direction the information was coming from. And then his credibility collapsed, as it always does when you repeat things that do not hold together under scrutiny. And his last book failed, and he has been a diminished figure since. What the Sussexes appear to have done is find a replacement. An Australian commentator who, it seems, has been chosen as the new vessel for the Sussex narrative in the international press, and who appeared on a major broadcast recently and said something that I found extraordinary enough that I want to take it apart very carefully indeed. She suggested, with apparent sincerity, that there is now real hope of Prince Harry being permanently welcomed back to the United Kingdom. Not just a visit, not a quiet family dinner, but a permanent return to something resembling a working royal role. And then she called it, and I want you to register the precise language here, a logical next step. A logical next step. After the Oprah interview, after the Netflix documentary, after Spare, after a family was branded publicly as callous racists, after all of it. And the suggested continuation of the story is that Harry comes back and does the royal wave outside a hospital as though none of the preceding years happened. That is not analysis. That is spin wearing the costume of analysis, and I think the reason an Australian voice with limited grounding in how the British monarchy actually functions was chosen as the vessel for it is that a British commentator, anyone with daily proximity to the reality of this institution, would have laughed the premise out of the room before the camera was rolling. Picture the scenario she painted. Harry comes back, brings the children, spends more time in the UK, and how it all fits with Meghan, she admitted she was not quite sure, which is one of those qualifications that tells you more than the argument it is attached to. Because, I'm not sure how it fits with Meghan, is a very polite way of saying, and this is where the whole thing falls apart. She framed it as the logical development of Harry publicly saying he misses home. He wants reconciliation. He wants his children to spend time with their wider family, including the Spencers. And a more grounded voice on that same panel cut through the entire performance with a single word that I think deserves to be made into a banner and hung outside Kensington Palace. Maybe, that voice said, the word sorry should come first. Sorry. One word. And it detonated the entire fantasy. Because think about what had just been quietly smuggled past the audience. The idea that years of public warfare, leaked conversations, branded accusations of racism, and 2 separate commercial media projects built on the ruin of family relationships could simply be folded up and tucked away without a single apology from the people who initiated and profited from all of it. The commentator was not finished. She pushed on into territory that I want to translate for you, because what she said next was accidentally the most honest thing in the entire performance. She suggested that Harry's renewed interest in the United Kingdom has been shaped by nostalgia, that the rage and hurt he felt when he left has faded, and that the UK is probably not looking so bad to him anymore, partly because of how things have gone in America. Let me translate that. What she was actually saying, without meaning to, is that the only reason Harry is looking longingly homeward is that the plan he left for did not work. Which, as I will say plainly, is exactly why they do not want him back. The British royal family is not a consolation prize. It is not the safety net you fall back to when the other plan collapses under its own weight. It is not the place you return to when the streaming deal ends and the speaking fees drop and the lifestyle brand is not moving at the rate anyone predicted, and you start to remember that back in the family you left, there is still something that carries genuine global weight. Something that opens doors and generates coverage in a way that no amount of Montecito branding can replicate. And the fact that this needs saying at all tells you something important about how completely inverted the narrative around this has become. Stay with me, because now it gets genuinely strange. And this is the part where the spin tips into something I can only describe as baffling. The same commentator produced what she presented as a secret, which is that there exists a photograph we have apparently never heard about before. A photograph of the late Queen Elizabeth II, together with Lilibet, the Sussex's daughter, taken at a birthday party in 2022, and that the people who witnessed this meeting told her there was a lovely bond between them, a warmth, something genuinely beautiful, and that the photograph exists and probably always will. I need you to sit with the obvious question that nobody asked her in that moment, which is, who exactly are these witnesses? Because think about it carefully. Who else would have been in a room with Lilibet and the Queen at a small birthday party, close enough to observe what she is calling a lovely bond? The only plausible witnesses are Harry and Meghan themselves. There is no one else who could be the source of this information. And if Harry and Meghan witnessed a profound, warm bond between their daughter and the late Queen, a humanizing, healing, deeply sympathetic detail of exactly the kind their entire media strategy has been built around, why have they never mentioned it? Not in the memoir, not in the Netflix documentary, not in any of the dozen interviews either of them has given since 2022. The silence around this supposed moment is its own answer. The public record of what actually happened is brief. The known meeting between the Queen and the Sussexes took place at Windsor Castle, where the Queen, who had serious mobility issues at that stage of her life, was based. The idea that a monarch in that condition would travel out to attend a one-year-old's birthday party on the grounds of another property does not survive common sense contact. The meeting we know of was short, was photographed by a palace photographer rather than a private one. And as far as the public record shows, the palace owns that image, not the Sussexes. That is the full picture. The secret lovely bond is, to put it as gently as I can, not supported by any evidence that exists outside the sources who would have a direct commercial interest in its existence. Now, let me bring you the comparison I promised you, because this is the moment the whole thing crystallizes. Piers Morgan, drawing on his direct social access to people inside this family, described a dynamic so precisely that I want to quote it exactly. The royals simply do not trust Harry and Meghan, period. And Harry, to them, is like Brooklyn Beckham is to the Beckhams, the spoiled son. And in his own savage way, he went further, suggesting that if you wanted to rank difficult sons, Harry gives Brooklyn a run for his money and possibly overtakes him, which is quite the statement about a man most people would describe as an aspirational figure. But then Morgan said something that opened a door into history that I want to walk through with you, because it is far more interesting than a simple insult, and it gets to the actual heart of why this situation is so much bigger than Harry and Meghan as individuals. He named the pattern, American women, he said. And then he said 3 for 3, which means there have been 3 instances of this dynamic playing out across the family's modern history, and that number 3 lands like a verdict rather than a coincidence. 3 for 3. Let me hold that up to the light for you, because the third in that list is Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee for whom a British king abdicated his throne in 1936, setting off a constitutional earthquake that the monarchy spent decades absorbing and never entirely forgot. And what that comparison is naming, whether Morgan meant it to or not, is a pattern the British monarchy has been running for nearly a century, which goes like this. When an outsider enters the family and the institutional machinery around the crown decides the relationship cannot be absorbed without damaging the institution does not bend to accommodate the relationship. The individual bends by leaving, or the institution closes ranks and moves forward without them. That is what happened with Edward and Wallis. He chose her, and the institution made him choose, him or the crown, and he chose her and left. And the family that remained absorbed the shock of an abdication crisis and carried on, because that is precisely what it was built to do across generations and generations of exactly this kind of pressure. It outlasts the individual. Every single time, without exception, it outlasts the individual. Now lay the present story over that historical template, panel by panel, and watch how cleanly the shapes align. A prince born into the family. An American wife whom the establishment grew to distrust, quietly at first and then rather loudly. A dramatic exit that generated enormous personal wealth from the documentation of the exit itself. A family left to manage the institutional fallout while trying to continue the ordinary work of the monarchy, and an institution that does not need to scheme or plot or meet in rooms to decide on a response because the protective instinct is older than any of the current players and has been refined across generations of exactly this kind of test. It activates automatically. It runs on its own history. That is why I take the weariness Morgan describes so seriously. This is not a bad mood that will pass when circumstances improve. This is a pattern with 100 years of momentum and a very specific institutional memory about what happens when that momentum is ignored. The monarchy is not angry at Harry and Meghan. It is something more fundamental than angry. It is running a script it has run before, and the script ends the same way it always ends. There is also the matter of titles, which Morgan has been pushing on quite aggressively, and which I think deserves more serious engagement than it usually gets in this conversation. A title is not, as it is sometimes framed, A personal possession that belongs to the holder in the way a name or a home does. It is more accurately a loan from the institution, granted in exchange for service to that institution. The bargain is simple and has always been simple. You carry the name, and in return, you carry the duties. You attend the engagements, you visit the hospitals, you represent the state when the state asks, and the title draws its value and its meaning from that service relationship. Remove the service and the bargain is broken, even if the title technically remains. So when two people keep the name and the standing and the doors that name opens for them commercially across the world, while performing none of the duties and, in fact, spending years generating commercial content that specifically damages the institution the titles belong to, you can understand why people inside the system feel the bargain has been fundamentally violated. They are spending the institution's currency while refusing to pay the institution's price. That is the heart of the case for stripping the titles. And stated plainly like that, it is a much harder argument to dismiss than it usually gets credit for. Which brings me to the BBC and the donation and the paper trail. Because this is where sentiment ends and evidence begins. And this is the part that should genuinely concern you, regardless of how you feel about any of the individuals involved. You will remember the donation. £1.1 million, reported as a personal charitable gift from Harry to a major children's charity, covered in glowing terms, generating exactly the international headlines a man trying to rehabilitate his image in the United Kingdom would want. A personal gift? A generous man reconnecting with his country? Look how much he cares. Except an independent researcher was suspicious from the start, and the reason she was suspicious is the kind of thing you only notice if you have worked in charitable giving and you have watched people use donations as PR vehicles enough times to recognize the engineering behind the number. £1.1 million is a very specific figure, and the specificity is not accidental. It clears £1 million in pounds, which means it converts above £1 million in almost every other major currency, which means the headline works globally, which means the coverage goes viral. She asked the broadcaster a simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand question. Was this a personal donation from Harry, meaning money that came from Harry's own finances? Or did it come through a third party or a foundation of some kind? And the broadcaster replied in writing. In writing, which matters enormously because it creates a record that cannot later be described as a misunderstanding or a miscommunication, that it was a personal donation from the Duke of Sussex. What the researcher then found, by doing the thing that the press is supposed to do and looking at the public record rather than accepting the statement she had been given, was in the public record of charitable transfers, sitting at the official regulator and accessible to anyone willing to look, was that the money had come not from Harry personally, but from a charitable foundation, transferred to the broadcaster's children's charity, and logged as such 5 months before the broadcaster told her it was personal. The broadcaster had processed the transaction. They held the documentation. They knew where the money came from. And when asked directly, they told her something the paper trail does not support. Now, there are a number of ways to read that. Perhaps the individual at the broadcaster who replied to the email did not have full visibility of the transaction. Perhaps the information was siloed. But what the researcher argues, and what I think deserves serious engagement rather than dismissal, is that this is one more example of the British establishment continuing to protect a man who, the establishment seems to believe, still warrants that protection even after everything that has happened. She asks, did he ever really leave? And that question, uncomfortable as it is, sits in my head because it is precisely the kind of question an institution as old and as carefully managed as this one tends not to want asked out loud. Not because the answer is sinister, but because the answer reveals something about how the establishment manages narratives in ways that most people would prefer not to have made explicit. Let me close every thread I opened, because I promised you at the start that every question gets an answer and every thread gets followed to the end. And I meant it. The Brooklyn Beckham comparison. Harry, to the people closest to the crown, is the spoiled son, the one who made the break, who generated the chaos, who the family has had to absorb and manage at enormous institutional cost, and who now wants back in because the other plan did not work out. And that comparison is embedded inside a longer pattern that runs all the way back through Wallis Simpson, because American women who the establishment decides to distrust are not new to this family, and the institution's response to them has been remarkably consistent across a century. The Australian commentator's logical next step, demolished by one word, sorry, which nobody has said and which nobody appears to be preparing to say. The working royal return is not imminent, and anyone telling you otherwise is either uninformed or has a specific reason to want you to believe it. The mood music has not changed in the ways that matter. What has changed is that the Sussex commercial operation needs visibility, and visibility can be extracted from a carefully managed trip in ways that have nothing to do with actual reconciliation. The secret photograph and the lovely bond, unsupported by the public record, contradicted by the silence of the people who would most benefit from sharing it, and produced from sources whose identity tells you everything you need to know about where it came from. The £1.1 million, not personal, coming from a foundation, reported as personal. The broadcaster confirmed something the paper trail does not support, and the researcher who found it was doing what good journalists are supposed to do, which is check the receipts before accepting the headline. So, after all of that, the Brooklyn Beckham comparison, the Wallis Simpson pattern, the Australian commentator, and her logical next step, the secret photograph that the people who would most benefit from sharing it have never mentioned the donation and the paper trail. Do you think the word sorry is coming? Do you think anyone in the Sussex operation is preparing to sit down and say, simply and without conditions, that they got some things wrong and that they are sorry? Because I genuinely do not. And I think a part of you already knew that before this video started, which is probably why you pressed play in the first place. Send this to the one person you know who is still convinced the happy ending is on its way, and let them watch it and tell you what they think. Drop your take in the comments below. I want to know whether you believe any of this reconciliation narrative or whether you called it months ago. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.